On that scorching summer afternoon, the sun blazed over Willow Creek Estates, the kind of suburban neighborhood where the HOA seemed to rule with more power than the city council and where appearances mattered more than kindness. Yet for one small family, it was supposed to be a rare day of peace. Olivia, a devoted single mother, had been planning this pool day for weeks because her 10-year-old daughter, Emily, who was born with cerebral palsy and relied heavily on her wheelchair, had been begging for the chance to finally dip her feet in the cool blue water like the other kids. And though it wasn't easy carrying her daughter's fragile frame and navigating through the judgmental eyes of snooty neighbors, Olivia smiled through it all because she knew the joy it brought Emily was worth every bit of effort. But as soon as they rolled through the wrought iron gates toward the pool entrance, Olivia noticed a sharp, cutting gaze on them. And there she was, Karen, the self-proclaimed enforcer of HOA rules, a middle-aged woman with a platinum bob that looked like it hadn't moved since 1995, and a sour sneer that could curdle milk, standing poolside with her oversized sun hat and clipboard like she was patrolling a crime scene rather than a family amenity. And the moment her eyes locked on Emily's wheelchair, her lips curled into that disgusted smirk Olivia had come to dread over the past year of living there. Because Karen had made it no secret she thought kids like that didn't belong in her community, Olivia tried to ignore her, focusing instead on Emily's laughter as she dipped her hands into the water from the shallow steps, squealing with delight as droplets sparkled like diamonds in the sunlight. But Karen's voice, sharp as glass, pierced the joy when she barked, "The HOA pool has safety rules, and wheelchairs are a hazard. You're violating policy." And though Olivia's throat tightened with anger, she kept her voice calm for Emily's sake, replying, "We're not breaking any rules, Karen. She just wants to enjoy the water like everyone else." Yet Karen took a slow step closer, her heels clacking against the concrete, and hissed under her breath, so only Olivia could hear, "Accidents happen in pools, especially with fragile children," sending an icy shiver down Olivia's spine. But before she could respond, another family entered, laughter filling the air, and Karen, ever the performer, pasted on a fake neighborly smile, strutting off as if she hadn't just threatened a child. Olivia brushed it off for Emily's sake, plastering on a smile as she guided her daughter into the shallow end, holding her securely while the little girl kicked her legs, water splashing everywhere, her giggles echoing like the sweetest melody Olivia had heard in years. And for a brief, fleeting moment, everything felt normal. But Olivia's instincts wouldn't let her relax. Every time she looked up, she caught Karen standing at the far end of the pool, pretending to scroll her phone. Yet her eyes, cold and unblinking, were locked on Emily like a predator studying its prey, and Olivia felt her pulse quicken, sensing something dark simmering beneath that fake HOA-approved smile. The longer they stayed, the thicker the tension grew, with Karen occasionally circling closer, making snide comments about noise levels and unsanitary toys when Emily dropped her floaty into the water. And Olivia could see other neighbors exchanging nervous glances, too polite or too cowardly to intervene, but no one dared challenge Karen's authority because she had built her reign of fear on gossip, fines, and threats of eviction. And Olivia realized then that this wasn't just about pool rules. It was personal, a cruel obsession Karen had with exerting power over those she perceived as weak. And in this case, Emily represented everything Karen loathed: innocence, vulnerability, and a reminder of humanity she lacked. And when Olivia finally decided it was time to leave, scooping Emily into a towel and whispering, "We'll come back tomorrow, sweetheart," she turned back one last time, her heart freezing at the sight of Karen still standing there, eyes narrowed, lips mouthing words Olivia couldn't quite hear, but could read in the venom of her expression. She doesn't belong here, and though Olivia carried her daughter home safely that day, deep in her chest a storm raged, because she knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't done, and tomorrow's pool day might not end with just cruel words, but with something far, far darker. The sun glared down on Maplewood residences the following week, when Sarah, a determined mother with tired eyes that had sleepless nights, wheeled her daughter Lily toward the community pool, clutching a bag of floaties and sunscreen like they were weapons against the judgment she knew awaited her, because every time they tried to enjoy something normal, the walls of that HOA seemed to close in tighter, and Sarah whispered encouragement to Lily, whose legs barely moved, but whose spirit burned. brighter than anyone else's, telling her, "You're safe, sweetheart, mommy's right here." And for a while it worked. The sparkling water seemed like a haven, Lily squealing with laughter as she splashed her tiny hands against the surface while Sarah held her gently, her wheelchair parked nearby. But as the joy began to bloom, so did the shadow of their tormentor, and there she was again, Karen, this time draped in a floral cover-up and oversized sunglasses that did nothing to hide the contempt in her eyes, standing near the diving board as if she owned it, her stare never leaving Lily's small frame. And Sarah felt the same chill from last week crawl down her spine, though she tried to shake it off, telling herself to focus on Lily's giggles. Yet every mother's instinct screamed that danger was closing in. Neighbors filled the lounge chairs, chatting, scrolling their phones, sipping iced teas. But when Karen strutted closer, her heels echoing sharply against the wet concrete, silence seemed to ripple, and she bent low enough for Sarah to hear her venomous whisper. "This pool isn't made for broken children. It's a liability," before straightening up and flashing a smile at the nearby lifeguard, who returned a hesitant wave, too timid to notice the darkness dripping from her words. And before Sarah could respond, Karen's hand moved with shocking speed. She shoved at the back of Lily's float, sending the fragile girl plunging forward into the deeper water, her little arms flailing as bubbles rose violently to the surface, her scream muffled by the choke of chlorine filling her throat. And in that instant the world froze for Sarah, her heart slamming against her ribs as she dove, dress and all, into the pool, clawing at the water with frantic hands, screaming Lily's name as neighbors gasped, some rising from their loungers but not moving fast enough, their shock rendering them statues, while Karen stepped back, tilting her head as though admiring her work, her lips curling in a twisted grin no one else seemed brave enough to call out. Underwater, Sarah's fingers finally found her daughter's slippery arm, yanking her up, sputtering and coughing as she pulled Lily against her chest, her trembling hands patting her back, whispering, "Breathe, baby, breathe," with tears mixing into the chlorinated water as Lily coughed violently, her face pale, her lips trembling, and Sarah's cry tore through the silence. She tried to drown her. Karen pushed her, but instead of rushing to help, the lifeguard hesitated, eyes darting between Karen, queen of the HOA, and Sarah, the mother branded as overdramatic, while whispers swept across the deck, some muttering, maybe it was an accident, others frowning in disbelief, and Sarah realized with dawning horror that Karen had already won the narrative, her crocodile smile painted on her face as she shrugged and said in a sickly sweet voice, "Children slip all the time, especially ones who can't balance," loud enough for everyone to hear, sending a wave of murmurs through the crowd that split them in half, defenders and doubters, while Sarah, still clutching her sobbing daughter, knew in her soul this was no accident. This was a warning, a deliberate act of cruelty dressed as misfortune. She wanted to scream, to call the police, to demand justice, but her voice caught when she saw Karen strolling toward the gate, her hand brushing Lily's abandoned wheelchair with a calculated touch. And just as she pushed it slightly askew with her foot, she leaned close enough for Sarah to catch her whisper carried on the chlorine-scented breeze. "Next time I won't miss," before she walked out into the blinding sunlight, leaving Sarah trembling in the water, holding her daughter tighter than ever, her heart pounding with the knowledge that this woman wouldn't stop, not until she finished what she had started. The days after the pool incident were a blur of fear and sleepless nights for Rebecca, a mother whose arms still ached from clutching her daughter, Hannah, against her chest as if letting go would mean losing her forever. And though Hannah survived the attempted drowning, her eyes had lost some of their sparkle, shadows of terror haunting them whenever water was near. Yet, what unsettled Rebecca even more was not only Karen's venomous threat, but the cold indifference of the HOA board, who summoned her into their pristine conference room decorated with fake plants and smug smiles, treating her like a nuisance rather than a mother seeking justice. Seated at the head of the table was Douglas, the HOA president, a balding man whose tie was too tight and whose loyalty to Karen was no secret, flanked by board members who avoided Rebecca's eyes as she recounted every detail of how Karen had shoved Hannah into the pool, her voice trembling with desperation, her hands clenching the arms of her chair as she begged them to take action. But Douglas leaned back, sighing dramatically, and said, "Rebecca, what you're describing is an unfortunate accident, nothing more," while another board member chimed in, children slip, especially those with special needs, the cruel insinuation slicing into Rebecca like a knife, and when she demanded to see the pool cameras, Douglas smirked and claimed they had been malfunctioning. That day, the perfect cover for Karen's crime, leaving Rebecca's stomach twisting in rage and disbelief as she realized they were protecting her, shielding the monster in their midst, not because they believed she was innocent, but because Karen had them all under her thumb. Neighbors whispered that she knew secrets, debts, affairs, even past mistakes, using them like weapons to silence opposition. And now Rebecca was trapped in that web, her daughter's pain dismissed as hysteria. The betrayal cut deeper when she confronted her neighbors directly, pleading with them to speak up. But while a few looked guilty and muttered that they saw something strange, most shook their heads and insisted Karen was a good woman who would never harm a child, their voices trembling as if they feared retribution more than they valued truth. And that night Rebecca found a piece of paper slipped under her door, the words scrawled in jagged handwriting that made her blood run cold. Accident happened. Stay quiet or the next one won't be. And she dropped to her knees, clutching it with trembling fingers as Hannah whimpered in the background, asking why Mommy was crying, and Rebecca, swallowing her fear, forced a shaky smile and said it was nothing, though inside her resolve hardened, because if no one else would protect Hannah, she would no matter the cost. But deep down she couldn't shake the gnawing dread that Karen was watching even now, smiling from the shadows, already planning her next move, while the very people Rebecca had trusted to keep her community safe had chosen to become Karen's silent accomplices. Late into the nights at Silverbrook Estates, where the houses stood tall and polished but the silence felt suffocating, Julia sat by her daughter Mia's bedside, stroking her damp hair as the little girl tossed in restless sleep, whimpering through nightmares that dragged her back beneath the pool water, her fragile hands clutching the blanket like a lifeline. And though Julia whispered lullabies and promises that no one would ever hurt her again, she knew her words were flimsy shields against the terror that had burrowed deep inside her child. Because since that awful day, Mia had refused baths, shrieked at the sound of running faucets, and begged not to be taken anywhere near the pool, her once bright and bubbly laughter replaced with quiet sobs and silent stares. And Julia felt each tear like a dagger to her chest, guilt gnawing at her for not being strong enough to stop Karen, anger boiling at the neighbors who turned their backs, and fear growing every time she saw Karen's face. Across the street, watching from her porch with that smug tilt of her chin, sometimes mouthing words Julia couldn't hear, but understood all the same, threats cloaked in silence. The harassment never stopped either, with Julia finding graffiti scrawled on her garage door reading "Keep her inside," and once even discovering Mia's stuffed bunny torn apart on the lawn, its head missing, the kind of cruelty so calculated it stole the air from her lungs. And while Julia reported these to the HOA, the board waved them off as juvenile pranks, their dismissive chuckles fueling her rage until she nearly collapsed under the weight of helplessness. Yet she never let Mia see her break, always forcing a smile, though one night, as Mia curled up in her arms whispering, "Mommy, she said she's going to finish what she started," Julia froze, her blood running ice cold, demanding to know when Karen had spoken to her, and Mia, trembling, confessed that Karen had cornered her at the mailbox earlier. That day, leaning down to hiss, "You can't hide forever, little one," before walking away, as if nothing had happened, and Julia realized with horror that Karen had crossed into a new level of brazen malice, no longer hiding her threats, but parading them where even her daughter could hear. And Julia spent that night pacing the living room, the shadows thick around her, clutching a kitchen knife in one hand while Mia slept on the couch, determined to protect her, even if no one else would. But as the clock ticked past midnight, she caught something strange out of the corner of her eye, a silhouette lingering just beyond the tree line across the street, too tall, too broad-shouldered to be Karen, standing completely still, watching the house with an intensity that sent a shiver down Julia's spine. And though her instinct screamed danger, there was something oddly familiar in the way that figure held himself, a soldier's posture, steady and alert, and she pressed her face closer to the window, heart-hammering, whispering to herself, "Who are you?" before the figure stepped back into the shadows and vanished into the night, leaving Julia shaken, torn between fear and an inexplicable flicker of hope. As if somewhere deep in her bones, she knew this wasn't another enemy, it was someone waiting for the right moment to return. In Crestwood Meadows, where the houses gleamed with trimmed hedges and polished mailboxes that masked the rot festering beneath, Laura nearly collapsed one evening when a knock at the door shattered the heavy silence of her living room, and when she opened it, there stood a figure she thought she would never see again. David, her husband, the man she had mourned as dead for years, his broad frame silhouetted against the porch light, his hair cropped short, scars visible along his jaw, and eyes that burned with a hardened fire that spoke of wars fought in deserts and jungles far from home, yet softened the instant they landed on the small girl trembling behind Laura's legs, their daughter Chloe, who hadn't recognized him at first, but whose lips quivered into a whisper, "Daddy," before she launched herself into his arms, clinging to him as though she might disappear again if she let go, and David's calloused hands shook as he held her, burying his face into her hair, tears slipping down his rugged cheeks despite the iron discipline of a Navy SEAL, because this was the mission he had never truly returned from, the family he'd left behind when duty called. Laura's knees buckled as a flood of emotions crashed through her, relief, disbelief, anger for the years lost, and overwhelming gratitude that he was here now when they needed him most, and when she finally found her voice, she whispered, "How?" "They told us you were gone," to which David replied in a low, steady voice, "I was injured, off-grid for months during recovery. I couldn't come back until I knew it was safe, until I was ready, but then I heard what happened to Chloe," and the way his eyes darkened as he spoke her name sent a shiver down Laura's spine because it wasn't just the concern of a father, it was the silent promise of a warrior who had seen too much blood to let another drop fall without consequence. That night, as Chloe drifted into peaceful sleep for the first time in weeks, curled against his chest, Laura and David sat at the kitchen table, the hum of the refrigerator filling the tense air as she recounted every detail of Karen's torment, the drowning attempt, the notes, the vandalism, the HOA's cover-up, and with each word, David's fists clenched tighter, his jaw grinding as though he was already calculating strategies, threats, and tactical responses. The Navy SEAL inside him awakened by the knowledge that his daughter had been hunted in his absence, and Laura, though part of her wanted to tell him to calm down, felt a strange sense of safety bloom inside her, because for the first time since this nightmare began, she wasn't alone. When dawn broke, David rose silently, surveying the neighborhood from the front porch, his trained eyes picking up details Laura had never noticed, the same dark SUV circling too often, the subtle flick of curtains in Karen's window, the nervous glances of board members walking their dogs. And when Laura whispered, "What are you doing?" he answered with a grim smile, "Recon. She doesn't know who she's dealing with." And though Laura's chest tightened with fear at the storm she knew was coming, she also felt hope for the first time in months, because David wasn't just a husband returned from the dead, he was a soldier who had fought enemies far worse than Karen, and now every skill he had honed in combat would be unleashed to protect the only mission that mattered, his family. By the time the cicadas hummed through the muggy evenings of Pinecrest Hills, the quiet veneer of the neighborhood was already cracking under the weight of what Michael, the newly returned father, had begun to uncover, for unlike the other residents who avoided Karen's wrath, he was no ordinary man. His years as a Navy SEAL had carved instincts into him sharper than any blade, and when his wife, Natalie, wept as she retold how their daughter Grace had nearly drowned under Karen's hands, something inside him snapped back into the soldier he once was, though this time the mission wasn't for his country, but for his child, and so he moved through the neighborhood with calculated precision, blending into shadows, watching, listening, piecing together a pattern of Karen's movements until her secrets began to bleed through the cracks. At first, it was subtle. He noticed how board members stiffened in her presence, how the HOA president avoided her gaze, but always signed papers she shoved under his nose. And then he intercepted whispers between neighbors at dusk, murmurs of Karen holding photographs, documents, proof of affairs and bankruptcies, leverage she used like knives against anyone who dared oppose her. But that was only the surface. Digging deeper, Michael discovered receipts stuffed into HOA, files showing massive mismanagement of community funds, money funneled into accounts tied back to Karen's maiden name, and late one night, crouched beneath her porch, he found a discarded flash drive wrapped in plastic, tucked into the soil like a hidden weapon, and when he cracked it open on his laptop, what he saw made his blood run cold. Surveillance photos, hundreds of them, not just of his daughter Grace, but of other children in the neighborhood, grainy shots of them at the park, the pool, even walking home from school, each labeled with notes in Karen's jagged handwriting about their routines, vulnerabilities who would make the HOA look bad or lower property values. And it dawned on Michael that Karen's obsession wasn't just with Grace. She had built a twisted campaign against any child she considered imperfect or disruptive, a campaign she enforced through fear, manipulation, and the silent compliance of a board too cowardly to resist. When Michael confronted Natalie with the evidence, her hands trembled as she covered her mouth, whispering, "She's been planning this for months, maybe years," but instead of calling the police. Immediately, Michael's instincts told him to wait, to gather more, because he knew Karen would wriggle free of weak charges, her influence running too deep. And so he followed her one evening, keeping to the shadows as she stormed into the HOA clubhouse, where he overheard her cornering Douglas, the president, hissing that if he didn't keep protecting her, she would leak his gambling debts and ruin his family. And when Douglas whimpered like a trapped animal, Michael realized the full extent of her power. She had turned the entire HOA into a weapon, each member a puppet on her strings, leaving families like his defenseless. But as he slipped back home and looked through the window at Grace sleeping peacefully for the first time since his return, Michael made a vow under his breath, a vow forged not in anger but in cold, disciplined fury. She thinks fear keeps her safe. She has no idea what fear really is, and though Natalie's heart clenched with dread when she saw that look in his eyes, the same look she had seen in photographs from his deployments, she also knew that Karen's days of ruling through intimidation were numbered, because Michael wasn't just a father, he was a soldier, and he was about to turn every ounce of training, every survival instinct, every tactical lesson he had ever learned onto the one enemy who had dared lay a hand on his daughter. The storm broke over Brookhaven courts on a night heavy with thunder and anticipation, the kind of night when even the air seemed to hold its breath. And inside their small home, Vanessa clutched her daughter Sophie close, praying that the horrors of the past weeks would finally end. While outside, Daniel, the father who had returned from the shadows of war, moved like a phantom through the rain, his sealed training coursing through every calculated step as he stalked the one enemy who had dared declare war on his family. Karen, the woman who had twisted power, fear, and obsession into weapons against children. It was almost midnight when he spotted her by the pool, umbrella in one hand, bolt cutters in the other, her eyes darting with manic determination as she muttered to herself about finishing what she started, and Daniel's jaw tightened at the sight of Sophie's wheelchair abandoned near the pool fence, planted there like bait, proof that Karen had lured them out into the night. But instead of fear, Daniel felt a cold clarity settle in his chest, because this wasn't just about HOA politics or petty cruelty anymore. It was an attempted execution, a predator targeting the innocent, and as lightning split the sky, he stepped from the shadows, his voice low and steady. "You picked the wrong family," Karen, making her spin around, eyes wide before they narrowed into defiance. Her laugh sharp and unhinged as she snapped back. "You think your little war tricks scare me? This is my neighborhood, my rules, and she doesn't belong here," gesturing toward Sophie's chair with venom dripping from every word. But Daniel didn't flinch, didn't blink, his boots splashing in the rain as he closed the distance, his voice like steel. "The only thing that doesn't belong here is you." And then Karen lunged, shoving the chair into the pool with a sickening splash as if to prove her dominance. But Daniel was already moving, diving with the precision of a soldier, into the churning water, dragging the empty chair to the side, not because Sophie was in it. Thank God Vanessa had kept her safe inside, but because he wanted Karen to see just how far she had gone, how insane her obsession had become. And when he rose from the water, towering and dripping, his eyes blazing with fury, Karen stumbled back, her mask of control finally cracking. Yet still she screamed about lawsuits and fines, threatening to ruin them. But her voice wavered under the weight of Daniel's. Silence, the silence of a man who had seen death up close and wasn't afraid to walk her straight into it. Neighbors began to appear at their windows, drawn by the thunder, The shouting, their silhouettes illuminated by lightning as they watched the showdown unfold, some gasping as they saw Karen brandish a kitchen knife pulled from her coat pocket, her hands trembling but wild with desperation, and she lunged again. But Daniel caught her wrist with lightning speed, twisting it until the blade clattered onto the wet concrete, her scream slicing through the night, and he pinned her with one arm, his voice a low growl inches from her ear. "You tried to drown my daughter. You threatened my family. You will never touch them again." And for the first time, Karen's bravado shattered, her face pale, eyes wide with real fear as the neighbors spilled outside, phones raised, recording, bearing witness as sirens wailed in the distance. By the time the police arrived, Daniel stood firm, Karen's arm twisted behind her back, the knife on the ground, the evidence of her madness laid bare for all to see. And as the officers dragged her away, screaming about conspiracies and how she owned the HOA, Sophie peered out the window from Vanessa's arms, her small voice trembling but filled with awe as she whispered, "Daddy, you saved me." Words that brought Daniel to his knees, his hardened heart breaking open as he pulled her into his arms, vowing silently that no monster, no matter how powerful they pretended to be, would ever threaten her again. And in the days that followed, as the neighborhood buzzed with gossip, the board collapsed under the weight of Karen's corruption, exposed neighbors. Finally admitting what they had long been too afraid to say, Daniel, Vanessa, and Sophie found peace in their little home. The shadows lifted at last, though every time Daniel walked past the pool, he felt the echo of that night, the thunder, the rain, the fear, but also the strength that came from knowing he had faced the enemy and won, not with weapons of war, but with the unbreakable force of a father's love for his daughter.